Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast and our special series, How to Get Started with Bees, sponsored by Better Bee, your partners in better beekeeping. I'm Jeff Ott.
I'm Kim Flottum.
And I'm Jim, too.
Hey, guys. Beekeeping Today podcast is proud to welcome the folks at Better Bee as a beginning beekeeping series sponsor. Better Bee's mission is to support every beekeeper with excellent customer service, continued education, and quality equipment. Just how? Well, many of their employees are also beekeepers who know your needs, challenges, and answers to your beekeeping questions. From the colorful and informative Better Bee catalog to the support of beekeeper education, including this podcast series, Better Bee truly is beekeepers serving beekeepers. See for yourself at www.betterbee.com. Today's episode is also brought to you through the continued support of the great folks at Global Patties. Global Patties is a family-owned company that has been in business for over 18 years, making protein supplement patties for honeybees. Global offers a variety of standard patties using a time-tested recipe of natural ingredients, with or without real pollen, as well as custom patties to meet any specific needs. Feeding your colony's protein supplement patties will help them grow by increasing brood production and increasing overall honey flow. Keep your bees going all season long by supplementing with Global Patties. Find out more at their website, www.globalpatties.com.
We want to thank our regular sponsors, Bee Culture, Global Patties, and 2 Million Blossoms for their continued support of our podcast, and welcome Better Bee as our How to Get Started with Bees series sponsor. Better Bee, beekeepers serving beekeepers. Hey guys, welcome back to the fourth and final episode of our How to Keep Bees series. It's been busy several episodes, hasn't it?
Yeah, we've done 3 so far, Jeff. And I think it'd probably pay to do a real quick recap on all 3 of them before we get started on this final one.
Let's do it.
Well, I'll go back to the first one where we talked about where you're going to put your bees and locating them, dealing with neighbors, ordinances, and then the types of equipment and the types of bees you're going to get. So if you're still wondering about, is it legal to put bees in my backyard, go back and check that first episode, because we put out a lot of information. Jim, I think on the second one we were talking about races of bees and things, weren't we?
We did give that a shot. It was an overview. We decided basically if you're a beginner, just go with what you've got more often than not. Italians are common stock. So we went through all that. I hope they remember.
Yep.
Yeah, sometimes I hope I remember.
Well, don't get involved in that, Kim. That's a personal discussion.
Well, then we talked about once you decide it's okay to put your bees in, wherever it is you're going to pick them, what kind of bees and equipment you're going to use, then getting your bees into your equipment. And Jeff, we had several ways to do that one.
Yeah, we did. The most popular way is just to shake them into the hive and close them up, and put the queen in there and close them up and walk away. Give them a couple days to get settled down. And that's always an exciting time. That was a fun discussion.
We touched a little bit on top bar hives and some of the other equipment that people might be getting into, but I think we'll go back to our standard piece of information is if you can, start with traditional equipment, because that's what most of the information is. That's what most of the people in your club are going to be working with. And if you've got a mentor, probably that's what your mentor is going to be working with. So with some of these other pieces of equipment and styles of beekeeping, go there, don't start there. I think that's probably a good place to leave that.
Yeah, and I think one last thing on just getting started, we suggested, as everyone does, or most people do, start with at least 2 hives, or start with 2 hives in case something happens.
Yep, that's right.
All right, so in this episode 4, our fourth and final episode, we're going to talk a little bit about managing growth that first month, the first couple months, and a couple issues that the beekeepers may or may not address as their hives grow and as they learn to live with their bees. So let's get right into it. So The last episode, we ended off with when to add that extra brood chamber. How do you manage the growth? Where do they go from there? Should they consider about adding honey supers going on? Do they have to worry about swarming? How do they manage all of that?
Depends on the season, wouldn't you say, Kim? If it's a very vibrant season and the flow is great and the queens are good and all the stars are aligned, a lot of things can happen. But more often than not, especially where I am here in Northeast Ohio, I'm just trying to get enough bees built up and enough honey in place to have those guys survive the winter okay. So I'm really probably just working in 2 deeps ideally. And if the supers are required, that's the boxes that goes on top of everything where the honey is stored. If I need those, it's just a very lucky thing. But more often than not, 2 deeps will get me through here. I don't know how about you are there where you are, Jeff.
No, in Colorado, I was able to get package bees to grow fast enough that I could get a honey crop off of them. Around here, I've not been so lucky, at least in my location. It's taken them a couple seasons to get to the point that I can pull a crop off of them.
Yeah, and I'm not far from Jim, so I'm in Northeast Ohio, but there's a couple of things that you're gonna want to watch for. Adding that second super is when you've got 4 to 6 frames with comb on them. In the first super you put them in, the first box you put them in, then you add your second one. And then you start looking at how are things going this year. And Jim, I always look at, I'm always, what's the word I want? I'm always optimistic that things are going to go well. So when I'm looking at 6 to 8 frames in the bottom box, 4 to 6 in the second box, I'm going to add that honey super. Because if you get an explosion on a honey flow midsummer, which we can do around here on clover, after the trees, some of the early trees have bloomed, clover and some of the summer crops, like Jeff in Colorado, you might get a box of honey at the end of the first year. Don't bet the farm on it. Therein lies the caveat is that you're probably not going to, and if you do, you're lucky. But if you do, then you're prepared for it, and that's always, be ahead of the curve instead of trying to catch up.
Especially if they're pulling out foundation. If they're pulling out foundation, they're putting a lot of energy into that. If you're able to put them on a drawn comb, then you might get a crop.
I suppose we could end or discuss this by saying if you're not really sure what you're doing, I think I would tend to put too much equipment on rather than find out you didn't put enough on. So I suppose if you're brand new, you don't have your mentor close by, you've driven your mentor crazy or whatever, then go ahead and put on too much. A lot depends on the season. First of the season, middle of the season, put everything on. Last of the season, you know that a dry spell's coming, and it's pretty typical for your area. You might want to kind of slack off on putting it on then. But any question?
Well, what about feeding, Jim? You just mentioned a dry spell at the end of the season. How long do I keep feeding these guys once I get them established from that package?
This is just one long series of guesses and estimations. All right. Let's put some parameters on that. The flow is slowing down and it wasn't much of a crop, and you put feed on and they take it. So if they take it, leave it on. If they don't take it, they're finding something else.
One of the things that I learned early on a package in a box like this, when they're drawing foundation, not comb, you feed them until they quit taking it.
Yep.
They will choose nectar and natural nectar and pollen over sugar syrup as soon as there's enough available. But if there's not enough available, they're going to keep eating what you're feeding them, and better to have it there, making sure that there's always enough food, maybe a little bit more than enough, always enough food for them, so that there's not 1 minute of being hungry. And yes, you probably get some of that stored in your honey super. And yes, some of that may end up there over winter. And yes, that's okay, because you're going to have bees with enough food to make it through that winter, I think.
This first year brings unique challenges and unique rewards. Number one, it's your first season and you're all keen on it and you're excited about it. Everything's fresh and new and you love beekeeping. And at the same time, there's a lot of responsibility on beginners to get those colonies positioned for winter, even a mild winter. There's a dearth. If there's a dearth of nectar and it's just cool, it doesn't matter if it's frigid or cold if they don't have enough. So I would feed, if it's just like supering. If you are not uncertain, let the bees decide. They'll let you know quickly.
Yep. One of the things is, editor, a call that I get, well, several calls every spring. Somebody stole my bees. I went out there today and there's nobody in the hive. What's going on? And I'm going to bet that both of you guys have had that happen at least once, and maybe more than once, but sometimes you'll go out and take a look in your bees. It's what we call absconding. They've left home for reasons. Well, what kind of reasons would they abscond?
They don't have any food. They may go look for greener pastures. Or sometimes, there's various maladies and diseases that can, in some cases, a small hive beetle. I know they're not all over the country uniformly, but a small hive beetles really take over and slime everything. That can encourage them to leave. So I guess it needs to be discussed, but it's kind of gloomy, isn't it?
It is. Another thing that can lead to this is, believe it or not, skunks. You get a mother skunk and her kits will come and visit in the middle of the night, and that happens 3 or 4 nights, and the bees are just going to go, I'm out of here. And the whole colony will leave, queen and all. They'll just leave whatever wax and honey and whatever they've collected, and they're looking for a place that's going to be a lot less troublesome. But there's other reasons that they're going to leave. And you mentioned some of those. Jeff, have you ever run into this either in Colorado or out west?
The skunks? Yeah, definitely the skunks. And that's one of the reasons I like to put my hives up on a hive stand so that the skunks have to stretch up to expose their belly a little bit. Is something I learned long ago that discourages skunks, is if they have to reach up high, that exposes their belly, and the bees they don't like being stung there. So the other thing I've noticed with some other beekeepers is that they think their bees have suddenly disappeared, but when in fact they've slowly disappeared over a matter of weeks, and due to a number of reasons that could be out there, and often maybe the queen quit producing. The packaged queen wasn't real viable, and then quit producing, or she died, and they were unsuccessful in raising a new queen. And if the beekeeper's not observant of the hive, is not into the hive enough, or is just not practiced enough, they may not notice that in the weeks preceding, and can run into issues that way.
That is true. It's slow and insidious, and you think your bees should be building up. Maybe you bought 2 or 3 packages. 2 look good. One's kind of run down. And we told you to look for eggs and those big fat larvae, and ideally a little bit of cap brood. That not being there, it may be time for some medical intervention by the beekeeper. Check out that queen while she's not working.
And this is, again, we're go back to knock on your mentor's door and ask them to come out and take a look at your colony bee. We talked about the skunks. Obviously, if a bear's in the neighborhood, you'd know that. They're not very. They're hard on equipment. There'd be no question. There'd be no question about you have a bear, or as we heard back in January, Kim, with Naomi. Wolverine. I mean, any of those
Wolverines. That was new to me.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm familiar with that.
Can we touch base real quick on Varroa mite? There's just so much information out there that wouldn't do a service to spend just a few seconds on it, but just a highlight on the Varroa and its impact to beekeeping.
Well, you kind of touched on two different directions to go here. And one of the directions that some people choose is, I'm not going to treat. If the bees can't handle the problems that they're encountering, then they're not tough enough to be around, and we need to select another strain of bees. And that's a choice. I'm not sure that you'd want to do that with your dog or your cat or your cattle or chickens or ducks. Just let them be what they are, but it is a choice. I think, Jim, the other one is to monitor and monitor and monitor, and then when the numbers from monitoring them get to the point where the people who know about mites are saying it's time to do something about the mite population, that's when you step in as a beekeeper, and rather than let that colony die, you're taking some kind of action.
I completely agree. Any new beekeeper starting now will start out knowing and hearing about these mites. We have some decent control procedures, not the end of the world, but if you let it go and you don't treat mites, they will get you sooner or later. If not this season, next season. So you got to do something. But the good news is we got a menu of controls. I don't know if it's proper to go into that here because there's so many of them. But if you do choose to do something about the mites, then talking with your bee club, listening, going to meetings, reading bee supply, bee magazines, talking to your mentor, you won't be left cold with this. You won't be in the dark. We've all been through this over and over again. So, yes, mites are there, and they're going to need some attention. I have found in my hard-headedness that you can't ignore them. You can justify, well, I'm going to be going to some vacation, or my job is doing something. If you sleep through it, they will not sleep through it.
I guess probably the best way to look at it at this level is that dealing with mites is a bell curve going from hardcore chemical to nothing at all, and choosing something in between that works for your bees and works for your philosophy on beekeeping. So you can treat with chemicals, you can treat with management, you cannot treat at all. So the people in your club are going to tell you what's working for them. You can make the decision, but know that poison isn't the only way, and know that completely ignoring them isn't the only way. There's something in between for everybody.
There is.
And that brings up diseases, because the varroa isn't the only thing that's going on up there.
Well, the thing is I don't know how to handle or what to say. I don't think people are just telling me a falsehood, but it's not uncommon to hear someone say, I've done nothing for the last 5 years and my bees are fine. Well, I do nothing and my bees are not fine. So I don't argue with people who say that. I don't doubt them. I just don't know why or what the protocol is that's making them be so successful. But if you're that lucky one, have at it. But most of us are going to have to take our vitamins and flu shots to stay healthy.
There are races of bees that exhibit a lot of tolerance for mites. Resistance to mite might cause problems. So they are out there, and if you can find somebody who's gone 5 years without treating and they're just fine, that's the person you want to talk to about getting some bees from. If you're going in that direction, they're out there. There's not enough of them out there by any stretch.
Yeah, I think that for a beginning beekeeper, I think that the best advice is to work with your club to determine what the area practice is, because you really don't want to be the beekeeper who's next door to another beekeeper who treats their mites and you don't treat your mites, because you definitely get into arguments on philosophical approaches and on bee treatment or mite treatment.
Well, that pretty much goes for all of the problems we're talking about here. I think, Jeff, I started talking about diseases a second ago.
Yeah, let's go on.
And it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. Is if you're watching your bees, there's some bacterial diseases that they'll get. There's wax moth and there's small hive beetle, and there's all manner of things that can cause bees trouble. And if you're on top of the situation, watching them and making sure that you're doing the management things that help your bees control these problems, then you're not using poison in your hive and you're doing things right. But if you're not watching, any and all of these things can get ahead of you.
I would offer that if you're bees, and you guys, I'll offer this and debate me on this point. If your bees are healthy and you're taking good care of them, they're gonna, other than the varroa mite, you're gonna do pretty good. If the problem comes in, if they get weakened, if their stress is just like any animal, if there's any stresses on it and the body's stressed, then you're going to be susceptible to diseases and greater infestations and other problems that we're talking about.
The analogy that I use on something like that, Jeff, is you. Imagine you've been working 60 hours a week and you're tired and you're hungry and you've got a lot of stress at home, and you get in an elevator to go home one day, and that lady in the back of the elevator is coughing and hacking and sneezing and coughing, and guess what you're going to come down with before you get off that elevator?
You're describing my last week and being in an airplane.
And you're describing all my grandkids who show up with all the mess, give me the neck hugs and the cheek kisses, and go home, and they get over it in a day, and I've still got it 4 weeks later.
That's exactly
what your bees are doing.
Yeah.
And so if they're stressed by food, by the weather, by whatever it is that's going on in their life, and suddenly you introduce one more thing, it's one thing too many, and they're gonna be more susceptible to that. So it's just being a good animal husbandry is what it is.
Well, let's touch real quickly on some of the bigger diseases. The American foul brood is one that comes up, and was the bane of beekeepers before varroa approached. Who wants to take that one?
I can start, but I don't want the whole thing by myself. Isn't that interesting that used to be the biggest thing? That was the biggest thing that we had, and it was just a small percentage. American foul brood's really well adapted to bees. It doesn't just wipe them out in great numbers. It wipes out hives, but it doesn't just come through like a scourge and take everything out the way that varroa did for a while. But it's very contagious and it's so persistent. So if you find a real good deal on some old equipment in some guy's barn loft at an estate sale that's just going for pennies on the dollar, kind of know where that equipment's been and what's happened to it. So it can, the spores, it's a spore-forming bacteria, and those spores can last for decades and decades. So it upsets your neighboring beekeepers if the word is out that you're dealing with American foul brood and you're not dealing with it very aggressively. But it's a traditional, well-established disease. There's things you can do for it. And even though I say all that, it does demand your respect. You need to have mentors there, and don't panic. Some of the appearances of American foul brood you can see other times inside the colony, and they don't always mean that you've got this malady, but always be looking for that and the other diseases too. One of our jobs as beekeepers is to keep our bees, protect our bees, help our bees, and always help and do no harm. So American foul brood, yes, watch for it, understand it. Don't go right to it as the first line of an impression of what disease you've got. Just stay calm, have somebody else look. And most states have bee disease inspectors that'll come out and have a look and confirm it or whatever. Help me, Kim.
Well, I was going to go. That's exactly where I was going to go, is that if you do have an inspector in your state, they can help you. They can identify these things for you, and either by sending a sample of your comb into them or having them come out and visit. Your mentor certainly is one of those people in your club. But if you've got a situation that doesn't look, and I use the famous quote marks, normal, on both sides of that word. If it doesn't look normal to you, then get somebody else's opinion. And, 3 opinions, if they're all the same, then you've got something. If they're all different, then get a 4th. But the one thing I also want to address with this is that if you've got any of these problems in your hives and they are slowly declining, they're going to get robbed by bees from other hives. and you've got a neighbor who's now robbing his bees or robbing your bees, and they're bringing your problems back to their home, perhaps. So that's one of the reasons to kind of stay on top of them also, is you don't want to share.
Well, so we've talked about beekeeping as being a visual and an audio type hobby, being aware of those things. American Foul Brood has a uniqueness in terms of smell. Who wants to describe the uniqueness of the American Foul Brood smell?
Well, that's the name, Foul Brood. It does have a sour, pungent odor.
Yeah.
And it's the smell of decay. And
some people say rotten eggs.
Yeah, dirty.
There's a resemblance to rotten eggs. And there are people, and I am not one of them, who can drive into a bee yard and say there's foul brood here. They're that sensitive to be able to pick up that smell from one hive in a crowd of 5 or 6. I can't smell it with my nose right next to the frame. Never have been able to. So it goes, runs the whole curve, and don't rely solely on smell, but also the other forms of identification for any of these problems.
I didn't know that, Kim. That's interesting, because I've seen people like you, when you're passing around an American Foul Brood frame and the whole room smells like it, and people like you put that frame right to their nose and take a deep hit. I think, oh my stars, that must have taken the hair out of that man's nose when he did that. But is it a third? There's some speculations that some people really can't smell the odor.
I'm one of them.
Since I can't hear, I've always thought that maybe what little brain power I've got is allocated to my sense of smell. I've only smelled it a few times when you get out. And boy, if you can step out of your car and 5-6 feet from that colony, smell that thing, it is cooked. It's toast. Done. You're done.
Yep.
It is a smell that once you smell it, you won't forget it. You know immediately that something's wrong. It's like walking down the street and smelling a dead animal in the culvert. It's just identifiable. There's no question about it. All right, so that's enough. American Foul Brood, it has an identifiable smell. There's some other tests you can look for it, but those are better to be seen through video or on pictures in a book. There's a lot of information for that. We touched on some of the pests. I can't remember who did, but who talked small hive beetle. I don't have that here in the Pacific Northwest, or at least in any of my hives. I won't say that they're not in Washington State. Anybody want to talk about small hive beetle? Because they are problematic.
I'll
That's a good word.
Take a shot.
Ahead,
that is a good word. If they were like the other diseases and they were everywhere, I think it'd be easier. I think there'd be grant funding and more possible solutions for these things, because they're kind of spotty. And if you got them, they're bad and they're annoying. And if you don't have them, then you just kind of want to stay away from that person. But a lot of people don't have them at all. In Alabama, one of the states that I'm familiar with, they were serious there. And you do have to change the way you manage your bees. You can't just bring in honey supers and let them sit around until you get to it. You got to bring in those supers and process them and get on with it. And they don't always come back with the same ferocity every season to these people that have them. Here where I am, when I see a small hive beetle in the hive, I'll run back from my yard to get my camera. And then when I get back out there, I can't find them again. So that's the extent to which I have them. And I guess I should knock on wood, knock on something, that's how it stays. You have them in Medina, 26 miles from you, Kim?
Yeah, I've got them like you do. I see when it's an event because they're just so uncommon, and it has to do with primarily where you live. The farther south you are in the U.S., the more issue you're probably going to have with them. It has to do with soil type, and it has to do with the length of the season. The soil type that I have up here in Medina is granite. It's that hard all of the time. And the life cycle of the small hive beetle is that the larva generally leaves the hive, gets into the soil, digs down a little bit, pupates there, and then emerges as an adult and goes on to infect more hives. If it can't dig into the soil, it's not gonna survive. So we don't have a big problem. I'm gonna guess that's kind of where you are too. You're a little bit south of us, but you still got some lake bottom down there, lake bottom soil. When you get into the Midwest and certainly the South, where the soil is softer, sandier, loamier, as opposed to clay, you're going to have more of a problem and a longer season for them to produce a population, and a milder winter for them so that they don't completely hibernate all winter. So it tends to be where you are. The nice thing about small hive beetle, I'm not sure I can use that in the same sentence. A good thing about having small hive beetle is that there are lots of ways to manage them without poison. And there are, what are those cleaning pads that people use?
They're microfiber cloths. I wasn't expecting that. You get them at automotive supply stores. You get them at the big box stores. Microfiber cloth. They have kind of annoying clinginess to them, and it's beekeeper derived. You cut a small piece of it, 3 inches, 4 inches square, and you put it on the inner cover where the beetles like to hide in the corners. And I guess they get their tarsal claws or something stuck on those microfibers, and then you come take that away. Bees will get stuck for a while, but they usually can dig their way out. There might be 2 or 3 weak bees there that didn't make it. You're right. There's all kind of things. We make this a gloomy discussion, but every one of these issues, if you have it, has some solution.
And you can get really complicated. There are small hive beetle traps that go on the bottom of your hive. Pretty effective, but it's one more piece of equipment you have to have if you're looking at cost here. But then there's the cost of a small hive beetle infection. So you have to kind of weigh the cost of managing them versus the cost of not managing them, and go with what you've got. If you're living in Louisiana, the cost of having them is going to be high. If you're living in Ohio, the cost of having them is almost non-existent.
If we could, I'd like to put some perspective on this, because I took my flu shot. I do the best I can to keep myself healthy. So it's not like that I can just walk around with impunity and never do anything to maintain my own health. I too, as do many people, try to take care of themselves. And it shouldn't be surprising that bees have issues too. So I'd like to suggest we keep it in perspective and not make it sound like that this is just going to be the death of my bee thing. Before I even get started, I got diseases.
Right.
Well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll have 1 or 2 of these issues and not others. But you need to know, just like I need to know about myself, that there's things that need to be watched for in the hive.
Be aware and be prepared, I guess, is probably the best way to look at it.
Well, it is, like Jim was saying, like you guys are saying, it's like if you're getting a puppy, right? At some point there's going to be problems with that puppy along the way. And you deal with it as it comes along, but most of the time it's an enjoyable little thing. Yep. Most of the time, until it tears up the furniture or something. But for the most part, we get them for enjoyment. The same thing with the bees. And so it's more of an awareness. Make sure that folks know that these issues can come up, and they're not the end of the world. There's ways and means and a lot of research going about finding solutions for them.
Oh, sure, starting beekeeping is exciting, but it can also be daunting. So many choices to make, and you'll want only the best for your bees. You'll have fun researching and buying your equipment, so you need a source of trusted information and supplies readily available to you. Better Bee is your partner in better beekeeping. Whether you're experienced or just beginning, Better Bee has everything you need, including customized beginner kits, Humble Abode's woodenware, Sheriff bee suits, licensed stainless honey house equipment, honey bottles, containers, and custom labels, plus educational books, posters, and more. Let Better Bee help you select what you need through their helpful customer service and informative bee supply catalog. You can trust Better Bee because they are beekeepers serving beekeepers. Find them online at www.betterbee.com.
So we left off with the small hive beetle. The other pest that a lot of folks will have to deal with are wax moths. And is that something that they'll really need to worry about out in their apiary, or is that something really more for stored products?
Well, wax moths are really easy to deal with. I mean, it's just fundamentally, they don't like light. So anytime you're storing equipment or anytime you've got a colony that isn't big enough to protect itself from wax moth, all you have to do is get the supers and expose them to light and air. You stand them on end, exposed on both sides, the wax moth problem is going to go away. If you don't, if you're storing them, stacking them in the back of the garage all fall and winter, and they're dark and it's closed up, you're going to come back next spring to a bunch of garbage at the bottom of the box because that's all will be left. So it's light and air, and store your boxes so that light and air can get at both sides of all of your frames. And wax moth aren't a problem. Keep your colony strong enough so that they can keep wax moth out of a closed colony that isn't getting light and air. And if wax moth are a problem, you're not paying attention at all.
Now that really stings, Kim, because I don't want to call any names, but I know some people very well who've had wax moth problems who thought they were doing the right thing. But they're a beautifully adapted pest. And the reason I think that they are a pest is because we've just given them a king's buffet. Normally, they're just finding a little nest somewhere in a tree and it's fairly poor rations. But when we bring in deeps and deeps frames of comb and stack supers and put them in a nice, dark, warm room, they must think they're in heaven. So a lot of that huge population and raising them to a pest status is because of our basic beekeeping procedures that we do. But I will add one good thing about wax moth. And you mentioned bees in a tree or old equipment that's sitting in a barn someplace. Wax moth gets in there, and if there are any pests or diseases in there, wax moth's going to essentially eliminate that environment for them. They're going to eat foul brood comb. They're going to eat all of the comb and foundation that the small hive beetle are living on. And once they run out of food, they're gone. They're out of there. So there is some value to wax moth in terms of cleaning up the messes we make, other messes that we make sometimes. Indeed, Kim. I even know it's beyond the scope of our discussion here, but I know beekeepers who routinely use wax moths to destroy the comb. This old comb, they want to get rid of it. It's not useful. It's not pretty. It's beyond its scope. Been damaged by something else. They encourage wax moths to eat that, and then once it's cleaned up, you pressure wash it, put a light coat of wax back on that foundation insert, and in theory, you can reuse it. I suspect it's just like the first time, but sometimes you can use these things in special situations to your advantage.
And then you harvest the larva and go fishing.
I wondered who was going to say that. There's even recipes outside of beekeeping for raising wax moths for the larvae or fish bait.
Yeah. They are a double-edged sword, but and usually it's just a matter of really the equipment. A healthy hive is going to take care of the wax moths. It's not something a beginning beekeeper needs to worry about. They will score equipment. They'll put a groove in your frame or in the side of the hive box. But as we're finding now, that's maybe a good source for the bees to put some propolis for that propolis envelope.
Yeah.
Well, all right. This has been a heavy discussion today with the bees leaving and the mites and the diseases and the pests. There's something we haven't really talked about in first year beekeeping, and that's the products from why do people keep bees? And that's the products that are produced from hives and from honeybees. Let's just spend the last couple seconds here of this episode talk about introduce on the honey and the honey crops, wax. Propolis?
Well, this first year is a launch pad, and it's getting your ducks in a row, if you will, because most of us who keep bees are looking for working with that beehive to harvest some of the extra products that they produce. Bees will make more honey than they need. make propolis to line their nests with, but they make more than they need. And they make beeswax that we can harvest and make candles and all sorts of things. So all of this that we've been talking about is getting ready for maybe the end of the first year, certainly years afterward. And honey and pollen propolis are the three big products that we use. Wax for candles and ornaments. Honey, of course, to eat and cook with, and propolis is a tincture or one of those products that you can use that will aid in your health and the bees' health at the same time. So the first year is a launch pad. Afterwards, you and the bees are going to enjoy what you're able to produce every year.
The only thing I'd add to that list would be the pollen, too. There's a lot of people who collect pollen from their bees and dry it and sell it.
Exactly right. It is one of the things that you should be eating, or you could be eating to enhance your diet. But the one thing you got to remember is all pollens aren't created equal. And the pollen that you're harvesting in the spring is going to be different than the pollen you're harvesting in the fall. And some of those things are going to taste awful. Some of them are sweet and mild and nice, but know that you're going to get seasonal variability on this product. And that's okay, because what I eat in the spring is different out of the garden is different than what I eat out of the garden in the fall.
The propolis thing is interesting because it's made in the colony. They collect that gum and resin and bring it back, and it's kind of a natural caulking compound that has some antibiotic resistance to it. And of the big sources of honey and wax and whatever, you mentioned pollen collection, propolis is kind of the unloved product. I'm not sure what to do with it. Years ago, I tried to make a varnish out of it because there's rumors that some fine musical instruments had propolis in the finish, pollen grains. So I made this tincture and built a small piece in my woodworking shop, and something like 9 months later, it finally dried. So there are all kinds of uses for making propolis, woodworking finishes and tinctures and whatever, but you have to commit to it to find the recipes. But I think propolis deserves more attention than it gets across the board from experienced beekeepers.
Well, it's been getting a lot lately when there's a whole lot of things going on in the beekeeping world as we speak that people are beginning to look at. Do the bees know more about taking care of bees than we do? And sometimes I think, sometimes I know that they do, and this is one of the products that they do. In the natural nests, they're going to, on the side of a tree, they're going to completely line the inside of that nest with propolis. It has some antimicrobial properties that you mentioned, some waterproofing properties that you mentioned. It plugs the cracks and crevices so small hive beetles and wax moths don't have a place to hive. It has a whole lot of value to bees in the beehive, and we systematically remove it so that they can make more of it. So I think we need to pay more attention to what bees are telling us about this product.
I agree. And the thing I'd add, especially for people just considering it, starting beekeeping, is that it'll take those bees several seasons. And in fact, they never get finished. They're always adding more propolis. So you'll still have nice, clean, pine-smelling woodenware for a year or two or three before you really begin to see that propolis communicate. It's like if you're the bad bee, you did something horribly wrong, then you get put on gum collecting detail to go out and collect the gum that's needed. It's miserable stuff to work. It can, while you're flying back, it can chill down, and it requires the bees in the colony heating it back up so you can get the stuff off. It just has to be the job that no bee wants to be assigned.
I never looked at it like that.
I don't remember seeing that in a Disney movie about honeybees. It was the bad bee who had to carry the propolis. All right, guys. Well, this has been quite the series. We've talked about a lot of the good and touched on the bad. What are your thoughts about the future for the beekeeper? I'll start with you, Kim and Jim.
Well, Jeff, I spent a week in September up in Canada attending the 2019 Apimondia meeting. And when I go to one of those meetings, my attention is always in the vendor area as opposed to listening to the talks, because I always kind of get the feeling that the talks are what is and the vendors are what's going to be. And so I pay a lot of attention to what these guys are thinking. And a lot of it you can discard offhand, but a lot of it you got to pay attention to. And I think the thing that I noticed the most in the vendor area at APA Monday, which is an international meeting, by the way, there's several thousand people that attend this meeting, was the beginnings, the good solid beginnings of electronics in beekeeping, of monitoring hives, of being able to watch them from afar, of being able to keep track of what's going on and being able to act instead of react because of this equipment. And we've had Jerry Bromanshank on our show a while back, who's talking about listening to bees and talking to them, listening to what they're telling you. I think there's going to be a lot more of that, and I think it's going to make life easier for us to let bees be bees so that we are acting instead of reacting.
I'd like to build on that a little bit, because the bees have always been bees. We have come a long way as their keepers, and that word keepers may have to change, because I have a hard time telling who's in charge. Are the bees managing me? Because they're making me go out and buy supplies and buy woodenware and paint and come back. So I'm not always sure that I'm the one who's managing the bees so much as they're managing me. But bees and their keepers have kept up and are keeping up nicely. I mean, we're electronifying the hives, and we're understanding much more about their personal life and how that benefits us. And the more we learn, the more we realize we had no idea we didn't know this much. So I do get philosophical about it. Beekeeping is adapting, it's keeping up. And the bees themselves, while they're not changing all that much, we're getting better at the job. I mean, I'm the most least objective person you could ask about the future of beekeeping. What am I going to say? It's dire? No, there's never been a time when beekeepers have just said, oh, my stars, we're in heaven here. Every phase of beekeeping has had its issues. And so just because we have issues now, when we have our pity parties about where we are in the industry and bees fading away, others have been through this, just become a bee historian and look at the old literature. We're just doing what's always been done. We just know more and we can communicate about it faster. So I think beekeeping is evolving, keeping up. We are getting more and more pests, and that's making a newer and newer model beekeeper that doesn't just keep bees, but they also manage this plethora of pests that we've accumulated from the world, kind of homogenize the pest of the world. But I don't see the end being at hand. I just see us adapting and the bees doing what they do.
Yeah, I look back on when I just started, I don't know, a lot sooner than you guys, at the end of the 80s, and the names have changed, but the problems are still there. There were problems back then, and there's problems today. It's what you manage, and it's just getting through, the time and space that we all live in. So I think for the bees, I think we need to focus on the enjoyment that we get from them, and if you making honey crops or the wax products, or you're into all of that, going to fairs, contests, competitions such as the honey shows, and all of that is part of the enjoyment. And I think personally it's positive. I think as Jim was saying, the more we learn, the more we respect the honeybee for what it is. So I think it's all really good.
I take that another half a step real quick, Jeff, is that one of the things that have been going on the last, say, 10 years has been a realization that bees are being challenged in the environment that we're providing for them, agriculture, and not enough food, and lots of pavement, and some of the pests that are around. At the same time, a lot of people in the world are beginning to go, wait a minute, we got to change some things here, and we're seeing a lot more people being involved with providing more food, better, safer environments, easier places for bees to be, better places for bees to be. Almonds is a good example. The almond growers this season are planting acres and acres and acres, thousands of acres of extra food. And that's just the beginning, and that's just almonds. So It's been a bumpy road, but it hasn't been, like Jim said, it hasn't been terribly bumpy, and I think it's getting a lot smoother.
So listeners have to this series have a lot of resources that they can turn to further their study of bees. There's probably not a probably about it. The honeybees. There's more written about the honeybee than any other insect, without a doubt. And several episodes ago, we had Jeremy Burbridge on, and he has a whole company built around selling bee books. And Wickwasp Press is all about selling books on honeybees. So there's a lot of resources out there. I would encourage listeners to be critical. Don't always believe everything you see on the internet, and don't believe everything you see on YouTube. But be selective in what you listen to. Listen to your mentor, and go to a club and join and find other beekeepers out there and ask lots of questions. Any closing thoughts, guys?
It's been fun.
It has been. It's been challenging because you've got a time limitation, but that's common. So you want to say a lot more, but you just can't. So,
yeah, there's a universe of things we could talk about, and That's why we have the podcast. Well, let's just drop right into it. Because this about wraps it up on this episode and for this special series on how to get started with bees. Before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, wherever you download and stream the show. Your vote does help other beekeepers find us quicker. And we really want to thank our sponsor for the series, Better Bee, for sponsoring this 4-part series. They've been with us the entire time. As always, we thank Bee Culture, the magazine for American beekeeping, for their sponsorship of the Beekeeping Today podcast in 2020. We want to thank our regular episode sponsor, Global Patties. Check them out at www.globalpatties.com. And finally, we want to thank you, the Beekeeping Today podcast listener, for joining us on this show. Feel free to send us questions and comments at questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Anything else in closing, guys?
Well, I just want to say welcome aboard, Jim. It's good having you here. Another voice, another background to add to our comments and the programs that we do here. I look forward to working with you.
Thank you very kindly.
I second that. All right, guys. We'll catch you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.